Yeah, I think that if you look at the original 6 teams in the National Hockey League, you look at some great, historical franchises, and I think that there's always a following that will be there across the National Hockey League and all of these other cities because of the following as the generations grew up with the Blackhawks, the Montreal Canadiens, the Rangers, the Maple Leafs, Detroit, the original 6 teams. And I think that the tradition and the history of these teams within the National Hockey League is significant to the importance of how the NHL is structured right now. You look at the rivalries in the NHL and you talk about this is an original six matchup, which really kind of stresses the history of the National Hockey League. You love to see these new teams in the National Hockey League. You love to see the California teams, the Florida teams, Phoenix, the Sun Belt teams that are now in the National Hockey League. Those are important pieces of the NHL. But really the basis, the core soul of the National Hockey League is the original 6 teams that you have. And the fan bases that they have there have spread out, throughout North America in supporting their game. And Chicago is one of these franchises with a great tradition, with the Wirtz family as the ownership, here in Chicago. The days of Bobby Hull, the days of Stan Mikina, Tony Esposito, Pierre Palat, all these great players that came through the Blackhawks and were a big part of not only this franchise, but the National Hockey League. And now what you see with the Blackhawks and Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane, obviously this franchise has reached a new level of excitement here in the city of Chicago. I had heard of Denis Savard. Obviously, he was a big name in junior hockey in Canada, and you still got to, back in those days, read the paper and find out what was going on or hear it on one of the few channels that you had. Today's modern media, though, puts everybody in a different light. Professional athletes, entertainers, really everybody has to understand that when they walk out the door, that they're in the public eye because of modern media. In some ways, I feel sorry for some of these young players in today's world, in sports world, because they don't have any privacy. But obviously, when you have somebody as significant like a Denis Savard coming up, and he was my same age, basically in the same draft, all that kind of stuff, that you knew that was your competition of where you were going to be, if he was going to be with one team, where you were going to get drafted. So you always followed what was going on there, even though it's not like today's modern media. I think it was a big shock to a lot of people in the hockey world because of the culture of the French Canadian and of the Montreal Canadiens and their rich history of grooming French Canadians into their organization and stuff. And you look at it and you can always say in hindsight, maybe we should have. But I think always the knock on Denis was that he was a small player, and was he going to be able to survive at the National Hockey League level? His skill wasn't questioned. I think people back in those days didn't realize how big a heart Denis Savard had and the way that he played at the National Hockey League level despite his size. You look at Wickenheiser and you looked at his numbers and you said, well, this maybe is a logical pick. I think Winnipeg picked Babbage second overall, then Montreal then Chicago had the 3rd pick and picked Denis Savard. They've never looked back. I mean, there's defining moments of a team's history, and you can kind of pinpoint it with the drafting of Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews, with the draft of Denis Savard. A new era came in the early 80s, and it was significant to the growth of this franchise that had so many great years with Denis Savard as their most dynamic player here in Chicago. But if you look back, you probably, again, in hindsight, could say that it was the wrong choice by the Montreal Canadiens, and I think that for years they've regretted it. Obviously, it didn't work out in their favor, but at the same time, you weigh in all kinds of factors. He was the type of player that you thought would succeed in the National Hockey League. Wickenheiser didn't work out that way, and in a lot of ways, you look at the career that Denis Savard had, a Hall of Famer, won a Stanley Cup, and now here in Chicago was one of the best ambassadors in the history of the franchise. When I came to Chicago, I was actually at the University of North Dakota, and we just finished winning the NCAA. And Chicago enticed me to come as a young player, 2 years in school, and then coming to Chicago. I didn't know what to expect. I walked into the last few games of the regular season that year. Denis Savard had already established himself as one of the top players here. There was Tommy Lysiak, Terry Ruskowski, and Denis Savard were the top 3 centers that year. I was a 19-year-old kid with wide-eyed coming into Chicago, the biggest city that I had ever been in at that time, and it was a really eye-opener of what the National Hockey League was all about. But I will remember this, Denis Savard was one of the first guys that came over to me and welcomed me to Chicago. That year I ended up staying and living at Denis's house because I was in a hotel, and he said, listen, Troy, so you're coming to stay with me. After the season was over, Savvy threw me the keys to his house. He said, lock up when you leave. He was just that guy. He was such a generous person way back in those days. And you looked at it and you say, it's what Denis is all about. He's a true, great human being. He loves to give back to the communities. He's still doing it now here in Chicago, especially as an ambassador for the Chicago Blackhawks. But I remember walking into that locker room, and there was guys like Tony Esposito. I think he was 50 when I was 19. I'm just kidding. But Tony was there, and you look at these players that you saw on TV, you heard about, you watched, and all of a sudden you're walking into a professional locker room. I think Denis made me feel very comfortable because we were basically the same age, and I think that he had learned a lot in his 2 years in Chicago before I came here, and I think that he understood how tough it was for a young player to come into a locker room that had a lot of veteran players, and Denis was one of the first guys that made me feel very comfortable, and to this day he's still a very good friend of mine. When I came into Chicago, I think there was an identity for Denis to recognize what I was going through as a player walking into a locker room. He had been there for a couple years. We were the same age, and he knew that it's not easy for a young kid to come in. Being a first-time person in Chicago, the city is overwhelming. The National Hockey League is overwhelming when you walk into the locker room. It's something completely different than what you're used to, and Denis Savard was one of those guys. And the same thing today, when you walk into a locker room, you're coming into a city for the first time. You're staying in a hotel, and it's not easy. You're on your own, you're by yourself. Denis was one of those guys. He said, Troy, he said, come on, you're going to come live with me. And I lived at Savvy's place for the remainder of that season. And when our season was over, he was heading back to Montreal. He gave me the keys. He said, lock up when you leave, and I'll see you next year. But that's the kind of the person Denis was. He had a big heart. He didn't want me staying by himself. He wanted me to be with Denis Savard, and I thought that was one of the coolest things that I could ever have been a part of early in my career. If you look at a player like Denis Savard when he came into the National Hockey League, he was probably a guy, as he was growing up, that everybody said, well, he's too small to make it to the National Hockey League. But you don't measure Denis Savard or some of the players of his stature by his height and his weight. You measure it by his heart. And I think that Denis Savard proved everybody that regardless of the size, that he wasn't going to back down at the NHL. And this is back in the day where the game was really hard. It was tough to play. And I think that Denis, when he came here, for a person who didn't have a great understanding of the English language, made it even harder. But as one of the most dynamic players that this organization has ever seen, you look at Denis Savard, and as a former player, when you played with him, you realize the heart that he had and the determination to, I don't think try to prove people wrong, but to prove to himself that he's a great hockey player and he deserves to be here. And I think I look back there and I see how skilled he was, how tough the game was back then. Denis Savard never backed down. He was always one of those guys that really took a lot of pride in the way that he played. He was for many years the face of this franchise and never took a back seat to the media when anything was ever asked of him. And to this day, I think that his learning experience early on in his career here in Chicago has served him well throughout his life and where he is now as the great ambassador. One of the most spectacular, I was on the bench, I had the best seat in the house. We're playing Edmonton, and they had great players. Kevin Lowe was on the ice, I remember. They had Mark Messier, Wayne Gretzky. They were the champs for so many years. And Chicago, like everybody else, felt that if it wasn't for the Edmonton Oilers, they had a real good opportunity to win the Stanley Cup. But Edmonton was just so good. But the goal that Denis Savard scored against the Edmonton Oilers, I think kind of epitomized what he was all about. Dynamic, a flair to his game, exciting. And even to the Edmonton Oilers, who were in that game, watching that game, those guys say that might have been one of the best goals that they've ever seen or a player had scored against him. It was incredible. He went through about 7 or 8 players, some of them a couple times, to score that goal. And on the bench, we just kind of looked at it and we're going, wow, did we really just see that goal? It was an incredible goal, and just really kind of showed what Denis Savard was all about, the ability to be elusive, to avoid checks, and some of the best players in the world defensively, and one of the best teams that has ever played in the National Hockey League. And for him to tear him apart like that and to score that goal as an individual was pretty amazing. I think the Edmonton players appreciated the skill of what they just saw on the ice. You're never happy when somebody scores a goal against you like that, but when you sit back, you're going, wow, that was a pretty nice goal. Playing against Wayne Gretzky, head-to-head for so many years, I hated when he scored against me, but I was going, man, that was a nice play. And I think that there was respect, obviously, between the players of the Oilers and the Blackhawks back in those days. It was a real good rivalry. We had solid teams during the whole 80s, and we met many times against Edmonton. And I think that they had a lot of respect by playing a playoff series against a guy like Denis Savard, who, was our best player. And you tried to shut down a guy like Denis Savard if you're playing against the Blackhawks. And I think that he proved to the Edmonton Oilers that day that, I'm a great player. And whether it's Wayne Gretzky or it's Mario Lemieux or whatever it is, I belong in the same breath. And I think that he, with that goal, which was the highlight for many years, and they still show it, one of the best goals that I've ever seen in the National Hockey League. The spinorama was something that Denis became known for. And there was a goal against Minnesota that he scored where he spun around, I think, a real good defenseman in Kurt Giles, and scored a big goal for us. And we saw it many a times. I wouldn't even try it in practice because I'd pull a groin. He would do it at full speed in a game. And I think that if you look at Patrick Kane now, and there's a real great relationship between Denis Savard and Patrick Kane because of similar statures, the pressures of a young player coming in and being the face of the franchise. They have a real good relationship, which started when Denis was the coach here in Chicago. But you look at Patrick Kane now, and he's doing a spinorama. He's saying, I'm doing the Denis Savard spinorama. And, Savvy was one of the first guys that ever did that type of a move. And boy, when you looked at it, it just brought the people of the old Chicago Stadium to their feet. They were so excited. He, again, was one of the most dynamic players that I ever played with or against. Pretty incredible. There was great straight line players and stuff, but Denis Savard, stick handling and phone booth, come out of the corner, dipsy doodle around, put it between his leg, do a spinorama. Pretty incredible, the individual skill that Savvy had. When you think of Denis Savard, you think the spinorama. And for so many years, the fans here at the United Center, when you think of Denis Savard, you think of the spinorama. I think he invented it. When he did it here at the old Chicago Stadium, it brought the fans to their feet. They were so excited to see that. I don't think I could do that in practice without pulling a groin. It's such a great individual talent. For Patrick Kane, who now is able to do it, he talks about it's the Denis Savard spinorama because that's where it came from. Such a dynamic move. Many players back in the day hadn't seen it. I hadn't seen it. And all of a sudden you see this guy at full speed going down the ice and spinning around and turning around and making players, good defensemen, look very average. And I think that, when you saw Denis Savard in his day coming down, that big flair that he had and the way that he skated and stick handling the puck, going from one side to the other, he put fear in the eyes of the defender.